Long before the first man took his faltering steps upon the soil of the earth, there was a world already old with memory. The story of humanity is not merely the story of one man or of one people. It is the story of survival against the indifference of nature, the slow shaping of intelligence out of raw instinct, and the quiet, uncertain dawn of a species that would one day dominate every corner of the planet. Yet before there was man, there was a wilderness of unimaginable scale and silence, a theater of life where other creatures ruled long before us. To understand the first man, we must first enter a world in which he did not exist. Imagine the earth not as we know it today, but as it was several million years ago. The landscape stretched vast and untamed, marked by towering volcanoes, endless savannas, and primeval forests. Herds of giant beasts thundered across the plains, early elephants with curving tusks, saber-toothed predators whose fangs gleamed in the fading sun, and packs of hyenas far larger than those we know today. It was a place where survival balanced precariously on the edge of tooth and claw, where every shadow concealed the threat of death. This was Africa, the cradle of all humankind. The continent we now know as the heart of human origins was already ancient, sculpted by shifting tectonic plates and divided by the mighty Rift Valley. Here, mountains split open, lakes filled with rain, and rivers carved their way through the earth, leaving behind the sediments that would one day guard the fossilized remains of our earliest ancestors. Africa was not merely a continent, it was a womb, and from its depths, the first whispers of humanity would eventually emerge. But humanity did not arrive fully formed. The first man was not a single individual, standing suddenly upright and aware, but the product of an unbroken chain of ancestors stretching back millions of years. To glimpse him, we must turn our eyes to the long march of evolution. Roughly 7 million years ago, somewhere in the wooded savannas of Central Africa, a creature now known as Sahelanthropus cadensis walked a narrow path between ape and human. From its skull, small, with a flattened face and heavy brow ridges, scientists believe it could walk upright, if only clumsily. It was not human, but in its bones we see the faintest glimmer of the path that would one day lead to us. It represents one of the earliest known divergences from the great apes, a whisper at the dawn of the human story. Over the next few million years, Africa became a vast laboratory of evolution. From Australopithecus afarensis, whose delicate bones were unearthed in the famous skeleton Lucy in Ethiopia, to the ancient footprints preserved at Litoli in Tanzania, hardened impressions in volcanic ash that record the steps of beings who walked upright nearly 3.6 million years ago. The continent holds the earliest evidence of a shift that would transform all of history: bipedalism. The Litoli footprints tell a story no words could capture. Two individuals, perhaps a man and a woman, perhaps parent and child, walked together across soft volcanic ash. Their gait was upright, their stride purposeful. They did not know they were leaving behind one of the earliest testimonies of humanity's ascent. To them, it was simply a walk across the land, perhaps fleeing danger or searching for food. To us, it is the frozen moment when we recognize something unmistakably human. Still, these beings were not yet men. They lived short, brutal lives. Their brains were small, their tools crude, if they had tools at all. They slept in trees to avoid predators, scavenged carcasses for meat, and survived in family groups where cooperation was the thin line between life and extinction. Yet in their upright posture, in the hands that could grasp and carry, the possibility of the future was already written. By 2 million years ago, the world witnessed the rise of a new kind of being, Homo habilis, the handyman. From the stones they left behind, sharp edges flaked with deliberate skill, archaeologists know these were the first true toolmakers. To strike one stone against another and fashion an edge was to cross a threshold into intentionality, foresight, and problem-solving. It was the first murmur of the intelligence that would come to define humanity. Here, at the dawn of the genus Homo, we stand at the shadowed edge of our story. The first man in the world would not yet have recognized himself as something separate, as something destined for dominion. He was still prey as much as predator, still part of a wider ecosystem that dwarfed him. Lions, leopards, and crocodiles held dominion. And yet, slowly, imperceptibly, something was changing. The climate was restless. Ice ages advanced and retreated in cycles, sculpting the earth and forcing our ancestors to adapt or die. Forests shrank into grasslands, and the grasslands expanded into deserts. In this crucible of instability, intelligence was forged. The first man, if we dare call him that, was a child of hardship, of shifting landscapes that demanded innovation, memory, and cooperation. Without the cruelty of climate, there may never have been the spark of mind that would separate humanity from the beasts around it. The Rift Valley became the archive of this transformation. Fossils lay hidden in its sediments, skulls with expanding brain cases, jaws that narrowed, teeth that grew smaller, pelvises shaped for walking. Each discovery tells us not of a single first man, but of a lineage of beings, each a little closer to what we now recognize as human. It is tempting to ask, who was the first man in the world? Science cannot give us a single name, a single face. No, Adam was standing alone in the dawn light. There was instead a continuum, a gradual emergence, a tide that rose so slowly no individual could have known he was the beginning. What we call the first man was, in truth, countless men and women, families and tribes, each carrying forward a fragment of the story. And yet, myths speak differently. Across the world, civilizations have told of a single first man, shaped from clay, carved from wood, or born of the breath of gods. These stories do not concern themselves with evolution or fossil strata. They are concerned with meaning. They ask not, how did we come to be, but why do we exist at all? And perhaps that is why they endure. Because in the vast silence of deep time, the scientific truth alone feels too cold, too indifferent, to satisfy the yearning of the human spirit. The prologue of our story, then, is not about an individual man. It is about a world waiting for him. A world of dangers and opportunities, of shifting climate and restless earth, of beasts that ruled and beings that dreamed. Out of this crucible, the first man would emerge not as a sudden miracle, but as the final note in a long symphony of evolution. When we turn the page from this prologue, we will begin to see him more clearly. His hands will grasp tools of his own making. His mind will spark with ideas that echo down to us. And though he will not yet know it, the first man will stand at the threshold of history, about to take a step that no creature before him had taken. There are moments in history so fleeting, so fragile, that they should never have been preserved at all. And yet, by a miracle of geology, they remain with us today, silent testimonies of beings who lived long before the first civilizations, before the first written words, before even the idea of history itself. Among the most haunting are the Litoli footprints, pressed into volcanic ash nearly 4 million years ago, in the lands we now call Tanzania. The footprints belong not to giants or beasts, but to a pair of small, upright walkers, our ancient cousins of the species Australopithecus afarensis. Their feet, human-like in shape, left a trail across soft ash that hardened under the sun and was later sealed beneath layers of stone. When they were uncovered in the 1970s by Mary Leakey and her team, the world stared in awe. For the first time, we were not looking at a skull or a jawbone, not at lifeless fragments of bone. We were looking at the actual steps of beings who had lived and breathed. It is tempting to imagine who they were. Perhaps a man and a woman walking side by side. Perhaps a parent and child moving cautiously through a dangerous landscape. Were they fleeing a predator, searching for food, or simply walking, unaware that every stride carried a weight of destiny, that in their footprints, the very story of humanity had begun to take shape. For here, in these tracks, lies the proof of one of the most important transformations in history: bipedalism. To walk upright was to liberate the hands, to carry food, tools, and eventually, children. It was to see farther across the savannah, to watch for predators, to plan, and to anticipate. It was the first step toward becoming something entirely new. But walking on two legs was not an easy gift. The skeleton paid a price for its new posture. The spine curved, the pelvis reshaped, the birth canal narrowed. To give birth became more dangerous, the pain greater, the risks higher. Yet the evolutionary gamble held, because it allowed these creatures to survive in a world that was changing fast. The Africa of 3 to 4 million years ago was a continent in flux. Forests were receding, giving way to grasslands and open plains. The predators that roamed these lands were formidable giant hyenas, saber-toothed cats, and crocodiles lurking in rivers. For a small, upright creature with little natural defense, survival demanded something new: intelligence, cooperation, and adaptability. The first footprints remind us of fragility, but they also mark the dawn of resilience. These early hominins, though not yet men in any sense we would recognize, were carving a place for themselves in a hostile world. Their hands, freed by upright walking, began to shape the earliest tools. At Oldoway Gorge, in modern-day Tanzania, stone flakes have been found that date back nearly 2 million years. Fashioned by Homo habilis, the handyman, these were not mere rocks, but deliberately shaped implements. With them, our ancestors could cut meat, crack bones for marrow, and defend themselves against predators. The making of a tool was more than survival. It was foresight, imagination, the ability to see not just what a stone was, but what it could become. To strike one rock against another, to flake off a sharp edge, was an act of transformation. It was the first echo of a mind that could dream, the beginning of a story that would end with rockets piercing the heavens and machines shaping worlds. But in those days, it was enough to split open the bones of fallen beasts and scrape flesh from carcasses left by lions. The footprints and tools tell us of survival, but bones tell us of life and of death. Among the most famous is the skeleton of the Turkana boy, discovered near Lake Turkana in Kenya. At 1.6 million years old, he was a member of Homo erectus, standing taller and more robust than his predecessors. His body already adapted for long-distance running under the African sun. His skull shows a larger brain, and his frame shows the strength of endurance. Yet he died young, perhaps at 8 or 9 years old, his body preserved by the sands. The Turkana boy's bones tell of a child who carried within him the promise of manhood, a boy who never lived to see his full strength, but whose kind would carry fire across continents, build rafts to cross seas, and outlast beasts far stronger than themselves. His story reminds us that the path to the first man was paved with countless lives cut short, with fragile children and struggling families, with the constant toll of mortality. It is easy to think of humanity's story as one of triumph, but in truth, it was written in hunger and fear. The early men and women who left their footprints at Litoli, who shaped stone at Oldoway, who buried their dead at the edge of rivers, they were not conquerors. They were survivors. Their world was dangerous, their lives short, their numbers few. But their legacy lies not in dominance, but in persistence. They endured, and in enduring, they left traces that whisper to us across millions of years. And yet, across cultures, we remember this differently. Myths tell us that the first man appeared suddenly, created by divine hands. In the Abrahamic traditions, Adam was molded from dust and given life by the breath of God. In Mesopotamian tales, the first man was shaped by the gods from clay mixed with the blood of a slain deity. In African oral traditions, The first people often emerge from the ground itself, as if the soil could no longer contain them. These myths speak of a sudden beginning, of a moment when man stepped into the world fully formed. But the footprints, the bones, and the tools tell another story, that our beginnings were slow, uncertain, and fragile. That the first man was not one man, but many. Not a miracle, but a struggle. And yet, perhaps the myths and the science are not so far apart. To ancient peoples, the creation of man was too profound to be told as a gradual tale. They needed a story of immediacy, of divine will, of sudden breath. Science, on the other hand, asks for patience, millions of years, countless generations, and endless change. Between the two lies the truth that humanity emerged not in a single instant, but that the moment was so profound, it felt like creation itself. So we return to the first footprints, still pressed into the earth. They belong to beings who are gone, who never knew what they had begun. They did not know that one day their children's children would build civilizations, sail oceans, and map the stars. They knew only the next step, the next meal, the next day. But in their footsteps, all of history was waiting. The story of the first man begins here, not with Adam or with kings, not with empires or temples, but with fragile prints in the dust, leading onward into a future unseen. For millions of years, the earth had been inhabited by creatures who looked almost human, but not quite. They walked upright, shaped tools, and even cared for their young. Yet something about them remained incomplete. Their minds were still bound by instinct, their hands clumsy, their voices little more than guttural sounds carried on the wind. And then, somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago, in the heart of Africa, something extraordinary happened. A new kind of being emerged, one that would come to call itself human. The fossil record tells us that this transformation took place in Africa's shifting landscapes, in the highlands of Ethiopia, the savannas of East Africa, and the mountains of Morocco. It was there, in 2017, that archaeologists unearthed the remains of what may be the oldest Homo sapiens ever discovered at Jebel Irhoud. The fossils, dated to nearly 300,000 years ago, included fragments of skulls, jaws, and teeth, belonging to people who, if dressed in modern clothes, might pass unnoticed among us. Their faces were flatter than their ancestors, their brains larger, their bodies fully human in form. These were not just clever apes. These were us. To call this moment the birth of our kind is both accurate and misleading. Accurate, because it marks the point when anatomically modern humans first appeared. Misleading, because there was no single day when one child was born different from all who came before. Evolution does not work in sudden leaps, but in gradual tides. And yet, looking back across the abyss of time, this is the moment when we can say with confidence, the first true men and women walked the earth. What made them different? It was not only the size of their brains, though those had grown considerably compared to earlier species. It was not only their ability to fashion tools, though theirs were finer, sharper, and more varied. What truly set them apart was something less tangible, yet infinitely more powerful: imagination. These early humans could think not just of the world as it was, but of the world as it might be. They could plan for tomorrow, recall the past, and share those thoughts through language. Their tongues, their throats, their brains had evolved to form words, and with words came stories, instructions, warnings, and dreams. This was the birth not only of man's body, but of his mind. Science has given names to our earliest ancestors within this lineage. Genetic studies point us to mitochondrial Eve, a woman who lived in Africa perhaps 150,000 to 200,000 years ago, whose mitochondrial DNA is carried, in some form, by every human alive today. She was not the only woman of her time, nor even the first, but she is the common ancestor of us all. In the same way, Geneticists speak of Y-chromosomal Adam, a man who lived tens of thousands of years ago, from whom all modern male lineages descend. Together, they remind us that humanity's story is both collective and deeply personal, that each of us carries within ourselves the memory of a man and a woman who once lived in Africa, whose children would spread across the world. The birth of our kind was not marked by triumph, but by survival. Life for those first humans was hard and often short. They hunted with sharpened spears and gathered roots and berries. They learned to master fire, not merely to cook, but to keep warm in the chill of night, to ward off predators, to gather in circles where stories could be told and fears shared. Around the firelight, humanity became something more than flesh. It became community. Archaeologists have found evidence of burials among early Homo sapiens at sites such as Kafza in Israel. Dating back nearly 100,000 years, skeletons have been found laid carefully in graves, sometimes accompanied by tools or ochre pigments. These were not casual disposals of the dead. They suggest a reverence for life, a recognition of death, and perhaps a belief in something beyond. Here, at the very dawn of our existence, we glimpse the beginnings of spirituality by the idea that life is not simply extinguished, but continues in some unseen realm. To think beyond death, to imagine what lies after, is a uniquely human burden. No other creature on earth has ever gazed at a lifeless body and wondered if the spirit lingers. Yet in those early graves, we see the stirrings of this haunting awareness. The first man was not only a survivor, he was a dreamer of eternity. But the world in which he lived was still shared with others. The first man in the world was not alone. Across Europe and Asia, the stocky and resilient Neanderthals thrived. In the mountains of Siberia, the mysterious Denisovans left behind fragments of their bones. In Africa itself, other hominin groups lingered, shadowy cousins whose names are only just being uncovered by science. For tens of thousands of years, humanity did not walk alone, but shared the earth with others who were almost human. The encounters between Homo sapiens and these other groups were not merely rivalries. DNA tells us that interbreeding took place, leaving traces in our genomes even today. In the blood of Europeans and Asians, fragments of Neanderthal DNA endure. In the people of Oceania, whispers of Denisovans remain. We are not the pure children of a single lineage. We are mosaics, carrying within us the legacy of vanished worlds. Still, it was Homo sapiens who endured, who spread, who flourished. Why? The answer lies in the very quality that marked our birth: adaptability. We were not the strongest, nor the fastest, nor the most fearsome, but we could adapt. We could imagine new tools, new strategies, new ways of living. We could share knowledge, not just within a family, but across generations. Culture became our survival tool, passed on like fire from one hand to the next. And so the first man in the world, if we imagine him, was not a solitary figure standing in the dawn. He was part of a family, a tribe, a community bound by ties of blood and language. He was not defined by his isolation, but by his connection. To be human is to be bound together. The myths echo this truth in their own way. In the Hebrew Bible, Adam is not alone for long. Eve is created to join him, and together they become the parents of all humanity. In Hindu tradition, Manu survives a great flood, not by himself, but by leading his people into a new age. In African tales, the first men and women often emerge in groups, not as solitary figures. Even in myth, the first man is never truly alone. The birth of our kind, then, was not an instant, but a dawn that stretched across thousands of years. From Morocco to Ethiopia, from caves in the Levant to the highlands of South Africa, scattered bands of humans lived, loved, hunted, buried their dead, and raised children who would inherit the earth. They were not yet farmers, not builders of cities, not yet writers of words. But they were us, in every sense that matters. When we look back on them now, we see not shadows, but mirrors. Their footprints are our footprints. Their hands are our hands. Their fears, their hopes, their dreams, they echo in us still. For the birth of our kind was not merely a moment in the past. It was the beginning of a story that continues to this day, written in our bones, our blood, and the fragile memories of a world long gone. For almost 200,000 years, our species lived only in Africa. There, in the forests and savannas, the first men and women hunted, gathered, and raised their children beneath the gaze of ancient stars. Africa was the cradle of humanity, the homeland of us all. But our story was never meant to remain confined within those boundaries. At some point, tens of thousands of years ago, a new impulse stirred within us, a restlessness, a hunger for horizons beyond sight. It was then that our ancestors began the most important journey ever undertaken, the long exodus out of Africa. The traces of this first great migration lie hidden in our DNA. Genetic studies suggest that all non-African people alive today descend from a single small population that left Africa perhaps 60,000 to 70,000 years ago. Imagine them, a few hundred, perhaps a few thousand individuals, walking away from the familiar landscapes of their birth, following rivers, coastlines, and game trails into an unknown world. Their decision, or perhaps their necessity, set the course of history. Why did they leave? The reasons remain shrouded in speculation. Perhaps it was periods of drought that shrank forests and dried rivers, forcing our ancestors to seek new lands. Perhaps it was curiosity, an innate urge to explore, to follow the coastline until the land gave way to more. Or perhaps it was competition, too many mouths, too few resources, driving bands of humans to venture into the unknown. Whatever the cause, the effect was irreversible. Humanity became a species of travelers. The first exodus likely followed the coasts. Archaeologists have found evidence of early human presence in Arabia, in caves at Jebel Faya and along the shores of the Red Sea. From there, humans spread eastward into India, Southeast Asia, and eventually reached the edge of the world they knew, with the vast Pacific Ocean. The distances were staggering, yet within only a few thousand years, humans had crossed them. By 65,000 years ago, people had already reached Australia, navigating stretches of open sea to settle its wild and alien continent. These early voyagers were not only survivors, but pioneers. Along the coasts of India and Indonesia, they gathered shellfish and fashioned tools from bone and stone. In Australia, they adapted to environments no human had ever seen before: deserts, rainforests, and strange marsupial megafauna. Some of their rock art still survives, painted on cave walls tens of thousands of years ago. The figures they left, the stylized humans, animals, spirits, are among the oldest works of art in the world, whispers from the dawn of imagination. Meanwhile, other groups moved northward into the Middle East and Europe. There, they encountered an ancient people who had long thrived in those lands, the Neanderthals. Stocky, resilient, skilled hunters, the Neanderthals had weathered Europe's ice ages for hundreds of thousands of years. To them, the newcomers must have seemed fragile, with their slighter builds and strange ways. Yet these meetings were not always hostile. The DNA of modern Europeans still carries the imprint of Neanderthal blood, proof that these encounters were not only of conflict, but of intimacy. Still, over time, Homo sapiens would prevail. By 40,000 years ago, humans had spread across Europe, and the Neanderthals had begun to fade into extinction. In caves at Chauvet and Lascaux in France, paintings left by our ancestors show herds of bison, lions, and mammoths rendered in astonishing detail. These were not mere decorations. They were expressions of memory, of ritual, of a mind reaching out beyond survival. With ochre and charcoal, Humans claimed the world around them not only as a place to live, but as a place to imagine. The exodus out of Africa did not end there. By 45,000 years ago, humans had entered Siberia, braving its frozen plains. By 20,000 years ago, they crossed into the Americas, perhaps by following herds of mammoth across the Bering Land Bridge that once connected Asia to Alaska. Within only a few thousand years, humans had spread across North and South America, reaching even the southernmost tip of Patagonia. The journey that began in the Rift Valley of Africa had carried us to every corner of the earth. It is difficult to overstate the magnitude of this migration. No other species had ever spread so far, across so many environments. From the deserts of Arabia to the ice sheets of Europe, from the tropical forests of the Amazon to the high Andes, humans adapted. They crafted new tools, built new shelters, learned to hunt new animals, and forage for new plants. In doing so, they became not just wanderers, but masters of survival. And yet, these journeys were not only physical, they were spiritual as well. To walk into unknown lands, to face the terror of the unfamiliar, was also to invent stories that made sense of it. Everywhere our ancestors went, they carried myths with them, stories of creation, of spirits, of ancestors who guided and protected them. In these tales, the world was not a blank map, but a living landscape filled with meaning. Through myth, humans domesticated not only land, but fear. The scale of the Exodus is almost beyond comprehension. By the end of the Ice Age, around 12,000 years ago, our species had reached every habitable continent on Earth. We had crossed deserts, jungles, rivers, and oceans, leaving behind a trail of tools, art, and bones that mark our passage. From a single cradle in Africa, humanity had become a planetary force. And yet, even in this triumph, there was tragedy. As we spread, other hominins vanished. The Neanderthals of Europe, the Denisovans of Asia, and the Hobbit people of Flores in Indonesia all disappeared within the shadow of our expansion. Their absence reminds us that the Exodus was not merely a journey of exploration, but also of replacement. Wherever we went, we survived. Others did not. When we think of the first Exodus, it is tempting to picture a single figure, a man, perhaps standing at the edge of the Red Sea, gazing across the waters toward Arabia, taking the first step into the wider world. But in truth, it was not a single man, nor a single moment. It was countless footsteps, countless families, countless children carried into new lands. The Exodus was not one story, but many, woven together into the great tapestry of humanity. The myths echo this truth in their own way. The Bible speaks of exile from Eden, of leaving a home once perfect and walking into the wilderness. Polynesian tales tell of great sea voyages, guided by stars and spirits across the vast Pacific. In nearly every culture, stories survive of migrations, journeys, and wanderings, echoes of that primal memory when humanity itself first left its cradle. The Exodus from Africa was the beginning of everything. From it would come the rise of villages, of kingdoms, of empires. From it would come the shaping of landscapes, the extinction of beasts, the invention of gods. But at its heart, it was a human story, the story of people who walked away from the familiar, carrying only fire, tools, and dreams, and made the whole earth their home. The world into which the first men wandered was not like our own. It was harsher, colder, and more unforgiving, a planet ruled by ice. For tens of thousands of years, vast glaciers blanketed much of the northern hemisphere. Ice sheets miles thick pressed down upon Europe, Asia, and North America, grinding mountains into rubble, carving valleys, and locking away the oceans in frozen prisons. In such an age, survival was not guaranteed. It demanded not only strength of body, but ingenuity of mind. Our ancestors were small in number, scattered across immense landscapes. Each band had only the tools they could make, the shelters they could build, and the food they could gather or hunt. Yet, they were not helpless. In the midst of ice, they discovered a power older than humanity itself: fire. Fire was the great divider, the force that separated man from beast. It had long been known to other hominins, perhaps to Homo erectus, for hundreds of thousands of years before. But during the Ice Age, fire became essential. Around its warmth, men and women could survive the winter's bite. With it, they cooked food, making it easier to digest, unlocking energy for hungry brains. By firelight, they kept predators at bay, extending the day into the night. Fire was more than survival, it was community. It brought people together in the circle of its glow, where stories were told, songs sung, and knowledge passed from one generation to the next. But fire alone could not conquer the ice. Shelter was also needed. In Europe, the people of the Ice Age built homes from mammoth bones and hides, creating sturdy frames to ward off the cold. Others found refuge in caves, whose stone walls still bear the marks of their presence. Handprints, paintings, and carvings that whisper of lives lived long ago. In these caves, the Ice Age men left their legacy not only in bones, but in art. The paintings at Chauvet, Altamira, and Lascaux are among the greatest treasures of our species. By torchlight, hunters painted mammoths, bison, lions, and horses with astonishing skill. They captured motion, depth, and spirit, transforming stone walls into living theaters. Why they did this remains a mystery. Perhaps it was ritual, a way to summon success in the hunt. Perhaps it was a myth, an attempt to weave meaning into a dangerous world. Or perhaps it was simply the joy of creation, the first flowering of imagination. Whatever the reason, the art of the Ice Age shows us that even in the darkest of winters, humanity dreamed. Tools, to have advanced in this age. The flint blades of earlier men gave way to more refined weapons, needles carved from bone, spear throwers that extended the arm's reach, and harpoons to fish the icy rivers and seas. With these tools, humans spread farther and hunted bigger game. Mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, and giant deer all fell before the skill of Ice Age hunters. Yet, with each kill, humans shaped the balance of the world, pushing some species toward extinction. It is here that the duality of man becomes clear. The Ice Age tested human resilience, but it also revealed human power. No longer were men mere survivors, clinging to life in the shadow of beasts. They had become hunters who could stand against the largest animals on Earth. In doing so, they changed not only themselves but the ecosystems they entered. But the Ice Age was not unbroken. Between the coldest periods, the climate shifted. The ice retreated, forests returned, rivers swelled. And then, just as quickly, the glaciers surged again, reclaiming the land. For our ancestors, this cycle of ice and fire meant constant adaptation. They moved with the seasons, with the herds, with the shifting lines of survival. To live in this age was to live in motion, never certain of what the earth would bring. It was also an age of encounters. In Europe, the descendants of Africa's exodus met the Neanderthals, whose stout bodies were built for the cold. For thousands of years, the two species lived side by side, sometimes in conflict, sometimes in union. Their blood mingled, leaving traces that survive in our DNA today. Yet, as the Ice Age deepened, Neanderthals began to fade. Whether by climate, competition, or simply the weight of time, they vanished, leaving modern humans as the sole heirs of the world. Meanwhile, in Asia, another cousin of Denisovans left only fragments of bone and teeth, yet their genetic imprint lives on in the peoples of Melanesia and Tibet. In Africa, other lineages may have lingered, shadows of forgotten tribes now lost to history. The Ice Age was not merely a test of humanity. It was a crucible in which entire peoples were forged, merged, or extinguished. And yet, amidst the cold, there were sparks of brilliance. It was during the Ice Age that language blossomed, that symbols and rituals became central to human life. Burial sites reveal graves adorned with beads, ochre, and ornaments, evidence that the dead were mourned, that lives were remembered, that humans had begun to ask questions of meaning. Who are we? What comes after death? What is the place of man in the cosmos? These questions, born in firelight and whispered in the caves, would echo through millennia, shaping myth, religion, and philosophy. The age of ice and fire was not only about the survival of the body, it was the dawn of the human spirit. By the end of the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago, the glaciers began their final retreat. Seas rose, forests spread, and the world softened into a warmer climate. Humanity emerged from this crucible transformed. They had endured tens of thousands of years of cold, hunger, and struggle. They had crossed continents, hunted giants, painted walls, buried their dead, and sung their stories. They were no longer a fragile band of wanderers from Africa. They were masters of adaptation, poised to build villages, plant crops, and raise civilizations. When the ice melted, the world of history as we know it began. But the memory of the Ice Age never left us. It lingers in the myths of a flood that covers the earth, in the legends of fire stolen from the gods, in the tales of giants and monsters that once walked the land. These stories are echoes of a time when man battled not armies or empires, but the earth itself. The age of ice and fire was the proving ground of humanity. It was here, amid glaciers and mammoths, firelight and shadows, that we became who we are. The world tested us with cold and darkness, and we answered with fire and imagination. In that struggle, the first men carved out the foundations of all that would follow. For hundreds of thousands of years, humanity's story was one of movement. Bands of men and women followed the herds, gathered fruits and roots, crossed rivers and mountains in search of tomorrow's meal. To be human was to be restless, never bound to one place, never trusting that the land beneath your feet would provide enough for the next season. But as the Ice Age receded, the world itself began to change. And with it, so did man. When the glaciers melted, the sea levels rose and the climate warmed. Grasslands turned to forests, rivers grew, and wild grains swayed in the wind. Animals that once roamed in great herds began to retreat, some vanishing forever. The mammoth, the woolly rhinoceros, and the giant deer became ghosts of another age. In their place came smaller game gazelles, wild sheep, and goats. For the first time, human survival seemed less about endless wandering and more about learning to stay. It is in this fragile, uncertain age, around 12,000 years ago, that we find the first signs of settlement. In the hills of the Fertile Crescent, a crescent-shaped arc of land stretching from Mesopotamia through the Levant into Egypt, groups of hunter-gatherers began to linger in one place. They built shelters of stone and mud, not merely temporary huts, but dwellings meant to endure through seasons. Villages like Jericho and Catalhayuk grew from these early experiments, clusters of homes with hearths, courtyards, and walls that suggest something astonishing: permanence. But what bound them to the land was not only shelter, it was food. Among the wild grasses of the Fertile Crescent, humans discovered that seeds scattered near their camps returned the next season as new plants. By accident or design, they began to sow and harvest. Barley, wheat, and lentil, once gathered wild, were now cultivated. Goats and sheep, once hunted, were now penned and bred. Slowly, a revolution took root. This was the agricultural revolution, and it was unlike anything before it. For the first time, food was no longer solely at the mercy of nature's whims. With effort, planning, and patience, humans could shape their own survival. The rhythms of life shifted, from the chase of the hunt to the cycle of planting, tending, and harvesting. Seasons became more than they became the calendar of existence. But farming was not simply a new way of eating. It reshaped the very structure of society. A settled village meant more mouths in one place, and more mouths meant cooperation and conflict. Rules were needed to share fields, water, and harvests. Leaders emerged, elders and chiefs who could resolve disputes and guide the group. With stability came growth. Villages expanded. Families multiplied. Within generations, the population of the earth began to swell. And as numbers grew, so did culture. The permanence of settlement freed human hands and minds. Tools became more refined, not just stone blades, but sickles for cutting grain, grinding stones for making flour, and pottery for storing food. Fire, once a defense against cold and darkness, became the hearth of the household, where bread was baked, meals shared, and stories passed. The earliest settlements also nurtured something even more profound: the beginnings of religion as we know it. In Göbekli Tepe, in modern-day Turkey, archaeologists uncovered great stone pillars carved with animals, arranged in circles that predate farming itself. Here, hunters and gatherers gathered not to live, but to worship. These monuments suggest that long before temples of brick and stone, humans already gathered to commune with the unseen. The act of building Toged, her of raising pillars to gods, spirits, and ancestors was itself a step towards civilization. Yet, the seeds of settlement carried both promise and peril. Farming offered more food, but it also demanded backbreaking labor. Fields had to be cleared, watered, and defended. Crops failed with droughts, pests, or floods. Unlike the hunter who could follow the herds, the farmer was bound to the soil. If the land failed, hunger came. Skeletons from the earliest farming communities reveal stunted growth, malnutrition, and disease. Settled life brought not only bread, but sickness spread through close contact with animals, waste, and crowded living. Still, the experiment persisted. For in settlement lay something that wandering could never provide: accumulation. A nomad carries only what he can walk with. A farmer stores grain, pottery, tools, and memories. Wealth measured not in coins, but in livestock, harvests, and land began to divide one family from another. For the first time, humanity began to know inequality. Inequality brought conflict, but it also brought innovation. To manage surpluses, humans invented counting, tokens, and eventually writing. To protect harvests, they raised walls, and with walls came warfare. The humble seeds sown in the soil did not merely grow food. They grew villages, then cities, then kingdoms. Civilization itself was born from this quiet revolution. And yet, in those earliest days, it was still fragile. Settlement was a gamble, a choice that bound people to the earth in a way no generation before them had ever dared. The first men who planted seeds did not know that they were beginning a transformation that would lead, in time, to pyramids, empires, and skyscrapers. They knew only that in the earth lay the promise of tomorrow's meal. We must pause and imagine what it felt like to be the first man who scattered seeds and waited. He must have watched the soil with hope and fear, unsure if it would answer. When the first shoots appeared, green against the dark soil, it must have seemed a kind of magic. The earth itself had become an ally. For the first time, man was not only shaped by the land, but he was shaping it. The myths remember this moment. In Sumerian tales, agriculture is a gift of the gods. In the story of Cain and Abel, one brother is a farmer, the other a herdsman, and the first conflict is born from settlement and the division of labor. Across the world, from Native American legends of corn maidens to African tales of yam spirits, the memory of planting and harvest is woven into the sacred. It was, after all, the turning point that made us who we are. The seeds of settlement did not sprout everywhere at once. In China, millet and rice were domesticated along the Yellow and Yangtze rivers. In the Americas, maize, beans, and squash formed the foundation of civilizations. In Africa, sorghum and yams sustained communities. Each continent, each river valley, birthed its own agricultural revolution. Yet all shared the same destiny. From settlement would come complexity, from fields would rise temples, from villages would grow nations. Looking back, the transformation seems inevitable, as though humanity was always destined to trade the bow for the plow, the tent for the village. But to those who lived it, it was no certainty. It was a choice, a leap into the unknown, as daring as the first exodus out of Africa. For by planting roots in the soil, humanity also planted roots in time. The first men of the world, once wanderers, became builders of homes, of families, of futures. The Ice Age had tested our endurance. Fire had tested our ingenuity. The settlement tested our imagination. Could we envision a life not of wandering, but of staying? Could we trust the land to sustain us, year after year? Could we build not only for ourselves, but for our children's children? The seeds of settlement were not merely seeds of grain. They were seeds of destiny. From them would grow the long, tangled story of civilization itself. The first seeds of settlement gave rise to villages, and villages became towns. But as humanity clustered ever more tightly upon the land, something new emerged, something more enduring than huts and harvests. It was power, and with it came the shaping of societies into patterns that would echo for millennia, the worship of gods above and the rule of kings below. In the earliest days, the line between the two was blurred. To live in a village was to share not only the soil, but the stories that bound its people together. The earth gave grain, the sky gave rain, and the sun gave light. These were not abstract forces. They were living presences, spirits, or deities who governed the fragile balance of survival. A failed harvest was not merely drought, but it was divine displeasure. A flood was not a chance, it was the hand of a god. Archaeologists uncover this shift in places like Catalhoyuk in Anatolia, where shrines adorned with bull skulls and figurines of great mother goddesses suggest an early reverence for fertility and strength. In Mesopotamia, clay tablets reveal offerings made to gods of rivers, storms, and fields, each tied to the vital elements of survival. Across the Fertile Crescent, the natural world was slowly reimagined as a divine order, one that demanded human attention, ritual, and devotion. But with gods came their earthly stewards. As villages grew, leaders emerged not only to manage fields and disputes, but to mediate between the human and the divine. Shamans, priests, and chiefs claimed authority as voices of the unseen. Their power rested not in muscle or spear, but in the belief that they spoke with the gods or were chosen by them. The roots of kingship were planted here, in the merging of earthly rule and divine sanction. By 5,000 years ago, the first true cities arose in Mesopotamia. In Uruk, towering walls encircled thousands of people. At its heart stood Zig, Urat's stair-step temples that rose toward the heavens, monuments of clay and devotion. Here, gods like Inanna and Anu reigned supreme, and kings ruled as their earthly representatives. Writing, once marks upon clay to count grain, expanded into hymns, laws, and chronicles. Humanity had entered history. The Nile Valley also birthed its kings. In Egypt, the pharaoh was no mere ruler. He was divine, the living Horus, the son of Ra. His command extended not only over fields and rivers, but over the very order of the cosmos, what the Egyptians called Ma'at. To serve the pharaoh was to uphold balance in the universe. And so, men raised monuments of impossible scale, the pyramids of Giz, stone mountains built to honor gods and preserve the souls of kings for eternity. Across the world, similar patterns unfolded. In the Indus Valley, cities like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa displayed order and planning that hinted at powerful elites guiding the flow of life. In China, the Shang kings presided over rituals with oracle bones, calling upon ancestors and spirits to bless their reign. Everywhere, the story repeated. Where settlement grew, gods and kings soon followed. Why did this happen? The answer lies in the scale of human society. A band of 30 wanderers needs no king, for disputes are settled face to face. But a city of tens of thousands demands hierarchy. It demands authority, order, and belief to bind strangers into one people. Religion and kingship provided this glue. By claiming divine favor, rulers justified their power. By participating in ritual, communities found meaning and solidarity. The dawn of gods and kings was not an accident. It was the necessary architecture of civilization. But power, once born, does not sit idle. Kings built armies, and armies built empires. In Mesopotamia, Sargon of Akkad forged the first empire, conquering city after city until the land between the rivers bowed to his rule. He declared himself not only king but steward of the gods, a man whose reign was blessed by heaven itself. In doing so, he set a precedent followed by countless rulers after him. Religion, too, has evolved. The earliest gods of river and field grew into vast pantheons, their stories interwoven with the destinies of nations. Myths of creation, of floods, of divine battles gave people a sense of origin and purpose. In Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh told of a king's quest for immortality, reflecting humanity's growing awareness of mortality and legacy. In Egypt, the myth of Osiris spoke of death and resurrection, offering hope beyond the grave. These myths were more than tales. They were frameworks of understanding, answers to the questions that haunted the first men who gazed upon the stars. Who made us? Why do we die? What lies beyond? Through gods and kings, humanity began to articulate its deepest fears and highest aspirations. Yet this age also revealed a darker truth. That power, once claimed, is seldom shared. Kingship created order, but it also created inequality on a scale unknown before. The gap between farmer and ruler widened, enforced by armies and justified by priests. The labor of thousands built the temples and palaces of the few. In the shadows of ziggurats and pyramids, ordinary men and women toiled, their sweat and blood transmuted into monuments of stone and divine glory. Still, there was awe. To stand before the pyramids, to climb the steps of a ziggurat, was to feel the presence of something greater than awe, whether God, king, or both. These monuments endured because they embodied more than power. They embodied the human longing for permanence, for meaning, for a connection between heaven and earth. The dawn of gods and kings was not confined to the old world. In the Americas, too, civilizations rose. The Olmecs of Mesoamerica carved colossal heads of stone, their rulers immortalized in features that stare across millennia. In Peru, the Norte Chico built monumental pyramids while cultivating the harsh coastal valleys. Though separated by oceans, these people, too, raised leaders and deities to guide them, proving that the pattern was universal. In every land, the first men and women of civilization stood at the threshold of something new, a world where the divine and the political intertwined, where kings claimed the heavens to justify the earth. This merging of power and belief would shape history's great empires from Babylon to Rome, from the pharaohs to the emperors of China. It would shape wars, laws, and cultures, for to challenge a king was to defy a god. But with belief came questions. If kings were divine, why did they die? If gods were all-powerful, why did floods and famines still strike? These tensions would spark revolutions of thought, prophets, philosophers, and reformers who sought new ways to understand the divine and the just. The dawn of gods and kings was not the end of humanity's search for meaning. It was only the beginning. We must picture, then, a figure from this age, not a hunter or a wanderer, but a man standing in the shadow of a temple. He gazes upward at towering walls, at carved figures of gods whose eyes seem to watch him. Around him, thousands labor, ruled by kings he may never meet. For the first time, humanity belongs not only to family and band, but to something larger, a kingdom, a civilization, a destiny shaped by gods above and rulers below. It was here, in the dawn of gods and kings, that humanity crossed another threshold. From scattered villages came cities. From stories around a fire came written myth. From chiefs came kings. From shamans came priests. From survival came civilization. The journey of the first man, once measured in footsteps across plains and rivers, was now measured in the rise of monuments, the rule of dynasties, and the worship of gods. And though empires would rise and fall, though kings would be remembered or forgotten, the pattern they set, the intertwining of belief and power, would endure. It was the inheritance of every civilization that followed, an inheritance born when men first raised temples to the sky and crowned rulers as sons of heaven. As we trace the journey from the first tentative steps of humanity to the rise of thriving settlements, it becomes clear that early humans were no longer mere wanderers of the landscape. They were builders, innovators, and thinkers. They tamed rivers to irrigate crops, shaped stone and bronze into tools and weapons, and organized themselves into communities bound by laws, ritual, and shared purpose. Cities began to rise, each street and marketplace a testament to ingenuity and ambition. Civilization, once a fragile experiment, had begun to take shape in all its complexity. Yet with complexity came vulnerability. The same irrigation canals that fed cities could flood or fail. The social hierarchies that brought order could breed inequality and unrest. Trade networks, while connecting distant lands, introduced dependencies that could unravel under strain. Human ambition, so vital to the rise of these early civilizations, also sowed the seeds of rivalry and conflict. Nature and circumstance were never static. Droughts, disease, and shifting climates loomed on the horizon. The rise of gods and kings gave structure to the world, but structure alone does not stir the soul. A temple may stand upon the earth, and a throne may command obedience, but the human heart yearns for something more, for tales that inspire, that echo the struggles and triumphs of mortal lives against the vastness of fate. And so, alongside the rule of kings and the worship of gods, humanity began to weave its greatest stories, the age of heroes and myths. These stories were not written at first. They sang around fires, in markets, in the courts of rulers. Bards and storytellers carried the memory of a people in their voices. Heroes were born in these tales, not gods, yet greater than ordinary men. They stood at the threshold between mortal and divine, figures of courage and tragedy, whose deeds explained not only the world around them, but the very meaning of human existence. The oldest epic we know is that of Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk. Inscribed in cuneiform upon clay tablets, it tells of a man who was 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. Gilgamesh was mighty, yet restless, a king who oppressed his people until the gods created a rival to humble him, Enkidu, a wild man raised among the beasts. Their friendship became the heart of the tale, a bond forged in battle and adventure. Together, they slew monsters and defied gods. But when Enkidu died, Gilgamesh was consumed by grief and set out on a desperate quest for immortality. What is striking in this ancient tale is not its age, but its humanity. Gilgamesh did not find eternal life. He returned instead to Uruk, resigned to mortality, but aware that his true immortality lay in the walls he had built and the story that would endure. In this epic, written 5,000 years ago, we hear the first echo of the same questions that still haunt us. What is the meaning of life, and how can one live beyond death? Other cultures, too, gave birth to heroes who bridged the mortal and the divine. In Greece, the age of heroes filled the space between myth and history. Figures like Achilles, Hector, and Odysseus fought not only wars but destiny itself. The Trojan War, immortalized in Homer's Iliad, was less about conquest than about honor, rage, and the price of glory. Achilles, invincible in battle yet doomed to die young, became the archetype of the tragic hero. His story asked, is it better to live long in obscurity or to die young and be remembered forever? The Odyssey, by contrast, reflected another truth of human life: the struggle to return home. Odysseus faced storms, monsters, and temptations, yet his greatest challenge was not the wrath of Poseidon, but the endurance of his own spirit. After 20 years, he returned to Ithaca, scarred by suffering but unbroken. His journey captured the universal yearning for belonging, for the hearth left behind, for the familiar faces waiting at the end of every struggle. In Egypt, myth took on the form of divine drama. The tale of Osiris and Isis was not only about gods, but about kingship, life, and death itself. Osiris, slain by his brother Set, was resurrected by Isis and became lord of the underworld, while his son Horus avenged him upon the throne of Egypt. To Egyptians, this was no mere story. It explained why pharaohs ruled, why life ended, and why the soul might yet live on in eternity. The Hebrew Bible, too, emerged in this age of heroes and myths. Figures like Abraham, Moses, and David were not demigods but men chosen by the divine, leaders whose lives became symbols of covenant, faith, and struggle. The Exodus story, with its plagues and partings of seas, spoke not only of liberation but of identity, a people bound together by memory, law, and promise. These narratives would shape the religious traditions of half the world. In India, the Mahabharata and Ramayana wove epics of staggering scale. The Mahabharata, longer than the Iliad and Odyssey combined, told of a great war between kin, interlaced with philosophy, duty, and the eternal conflict between dharma and desire. Within it lies the Bhagavad Gita, a dialogue between the warrior Arjuna and the god Krishna, exploring questions of morality, fate, and the meaning of action. These stories, sung and remembered, became not only literature but scripture, guiding the lives of millions. In China, heroes arose who were not only warriors but sages. The tales of Yu the Great, who tamed the floods, or the Yellow Emperor, who founded the nation, were as much about civilization as conquest. They told of leaders who brought order to chaos, who gave laws, calendars, and rituals. These figures blurred the line between myth and history, embodying ideals that shaped the Chinese world for centuries. Even in lands far removed, myths flourished. Among the Norse, sagas told of Odin, Thor, and Loki, gods who walked the line between hero and deity, whose struggles foretold the doom of Ragnarok, when the world would end in fire and ice. Among the Polynesians, the trickster hero Maui fished islands from the sea and stole fire for mankind. In the Americas, the Maya told of the hero twins, who descended into the underworld to outwit the gods of death. What unites all these myths is not geography, but purpose. The age of heroes and myths also revealed another truth: that storytelling itself is power. Kings commissioned epics to legitimize their rule, claiming descent from heroes or gods. Priests recited myths to enforce rituals and moral codes. Storytellers held no thrones, yet they shaped the imagination of nations. Through myth, humanity created not only gods and kings, but identity and destiny. Yet beneath the grandeur, these stories remain deeply human. Achilles wept for Patroclus. Gilgamesh grieved for Enkidu. Odysseus longed for Penelope. Rama suffered exile. Even divine tales of Osiris and Isis revolved around love, loss, betrayal, and hope. The myths endured because they spoke not only of gods and wars, but of the same emotions that stir us today. In this age, humanity discovered that the pen, or more accurately, the voice, could rival the sword. A king's palace might crumble, but a hero's tale could outlive empires. And indeed, many have. Thousands of years after Gilgamesh was first etched into clay, his story is still read. Homer's epics still move hearts. The Mahabharata still shapes India, and the Bible still guides faith across continents. The age of heroes and myths did not pass. It became part of the human condition itself. We can imagine now a gathering long ago, a circle of listeners beneath the stars, a bard reciting verses of a hero's struggle. Children lean forward, eyes wide. Warriors nod at familiar battles. Elders reflect on the lessons woven in the tale. In that moment, they are more than villagers or subjects. They are participants in a story that transcends time. And perhaps this is the true legacy of the first man in the world. Not the tools he fashioned or the cities he raised, but the stories he told. In stories, humanity found a way to grasp eternity, to live beyond death, to pass meaning from one generation to the next. In myths and heroes, mankind learned to weave memory into immortality. The age of heroes and myths was not a detour from history. It was its very foundation. For long before chronicles and archives, it was stories that bound humanity together, that taught right from wrong, that explained the world and our place within it. The hero's journey was, and remains, our own. For the first time, humanity had built cities. Stone walls encircled towns. Temples rose above fields. Kings and priests wielded authority, while scribes recorded every harvest, tribute, and decree. Civilization was no longer a dream. It was a tangible reality. Yet with this new order came unforeseen fragility. Power, organization, and complexity, while creating prosperity, also carried seeds of vulnerability. The first civilizations, magnificent and ambitious, were also the first to experience crisis on a grand scale. From Mesopotamia to Egypt, from the Indus Valley to the Nile, early civilizations faced threats both natural and human. Rivers that nourished crops could also flood, drowning fields and settlements. Droughts struck suddenly, turning fertile plains to dust. Earthquakes toppled walls and temples. And yet the crises were not merely environmental. They were social, political, and economic. Kings might die without heirs. Rival factions could seize power. Trade routes could collapse. Cities that had grown slowly over generations could crumble overnight. Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, is a case study in both ingenuity and vulnerability. Sumerian cities like Ur, Uruk, and Lagash flourished with irrigation systems that transformed arid lands into fertile crescents. Yet those same irrigation networks required constant maintenance. Neglect them, and salt would accumulate, soil would degrade, and crops would fail. Historians call it the paradox of civilization. The very structures that enabled growth could also bring decline. The first empires also confronted conflict. As cities grew wealthy, envy and ambition arose. Kings sought to expand territories, armies clashed, and borders shifted with violent frequency. In Sumer, city-states warred endlessly, and the Akkadian Empire, under Sargon, faced constant rebellion. The consolidation of power created scale, but it also made the collapse more catastrophic. A single failed harvest, a revolt, or a foreign invasion could destabilize an entire civilization. Egypt, by contrast, seemed more stable thanks to the Nile. Its annual floods brought predictability, yet even the Nile could not protect against famine, disease, or political intrigue. During the first intermediate period, central authority weakened, and local governors, once loyal to the pharaoh, asserted autonomy. Civilization, though monumental in stone and art, remained dependent on fragile social contracts and natural rhythms. The Indus Valley civilization offers another lesson. Cities like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa were meticulously planned, with sophisticated drainage, granaries, and urban layouts. Yet within centuries, these centers were abandoned. Archaeologists debate the cause: climate change, river course shifts, earthquakes, or perhaps social upheaval. Whatever the reason, the collapse was swift, leaving a ghostly imprint of streets and walls, and a civilization whose script remains undeciphered. Their disappearance reminds us that even brilliance cannot guarantee permanence. Crises of early civilization were not limited to environmental or structural failures. Disease, too, played a role. In densely packed settlements, pathogens could spread with alarming speed. Archaeological evidence suggests outbreaks of tuberculosis, leprosy, and other infectious diseases were present in urban centers thousands of years ago. In a world without medicine, a single epidemic could wipe out a generation, weakening society and altering the course of history. Economics also introduced tension. Surplus crops allowed cities to thrive, but they also introduced inequality. Merchants, priests, and rulers accumulated wealth, while laborers and farmers bore the brunt of toil. Resentment brewed. Revolts occasionally flared, as in the case of the early city-states of Mesopotamia. Civilization, it seems, was always a negotiation between abundance and fairness, between authority and consent. Cultural and ideological crises were equally potent. Early civilizations codified laws, rituals, and norms to maintain order. Hammurabi's code in Babylon exemplifies this effort, defining justice in explicit terms. Yet even the strictest laws could not prevent human ambition or folly. When moral or religious authority faltered, the social fabric strained. Priests and kings wielded power through the belief of their people, and when that belief eroded, so too did civilization's stability. Natural disasters often magnified these vulnerabilities. Earthquakes in Anatolia toppled cities. River floods in Mesopotamia drowned farmland. Volcanic eruptions altered the climate and crops. In China, the Yellow River was known as China's sorrow, bringing both sustenance and devastation. Every civilization, no matter how advanced, faced the delicate balance between harnessing nature and surviving its wrath. The first civilizations were also defined by their capacity for adaptation. Some cities rebuilt after a flood or fire, adjusting irrigation or urban planning. Empires adapted by codifying laws and forging alliances, consolidating armies and resources. Yet adaptation had limits. Even the most resilient societies eventually faced existential threats they could not fully control. The rise and fall of Sumerian city-states, the decline of the Indus Valley, and the intermittent collapse of dynasties in Egypt illustrate the precarious nature of early urban life. It is crucial to remember that crises were not always destructive. They also prompted innovation. These crises, however, left lessons for future generations. They demonstrated the necessity of planning, governance, and social cohesion. They revealed the consequences of inequality and exploitation. They underscored the need for innovation, communication, and adaptation. In every collapse, fragments survived walls, artifacts, myths, and knowledge that would inform the rise of subsequent civilizations. By studying these first crises, we can see the cyclical pattern that would recur throughout history: growth, overextension, stress, collapse, and renewal. Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and China all show variations on this theme. Civilization was never linear. It was a complex dance between human ambition and environmental reality, between innovation and fragility, between power and vulnerability. As we reflect on the first civilizations in crisis, it is remarkable to consider the endurance of humanity. Though cities fell, populations migrated, cultures adapted, and knowledge persisted. The lessons of collapse were preserved in writing, myth, and ritual. Humanity learned that survival demanded not only skill and labor, but foresight, cooperation, and wisdom. The story of early civilization is therefore both cautionary and inspiring, a tale of fragility met with ingenuity, of triumph shadowed by vulnerability, and of societies that endured long enough to pass their knowledge to us. The first civilizations in crisis remind us that history is a delicate balance. Monuments endure in stone, but societies endure only through human action, cooperation, and resilience. Every flood, every famine, every rebellion shaped the trajectory of human culture. Our ancestors were architects of both creation and collapse, and their struggles echo across time, whispering a lesson still vital today. To build is to risk, to govern is to challenge fate, and to survive is to adapt. Humanity had endured the Ice Age, tamed fire, sown seeds, built cities, worshipped gods, and witnessed the rise and fall of kings. Yet for all of these accomplishments, much of our early story remained ephemeral, spoken in voices that faded with time, inscribed in footprints that the wind would erase, engraved in bones that would crumble. Civilization had achieved permanence in stone and settlement, but memory, true memory, was fragile. It was here, in this delicate space between survival and remembrance, that humanity created a miracle: writing. The birth of written history was not a single event, nor a sudden invention. It was a process, an evolution driven by necessity, creativity, and the unyielding human desire to remember and control the world. Around 5,200 years ago in Mesopotamia, in the city of Uruk, clay tokens and pictographs evolved into cuneiform, a system of wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay. What began as simple tallies of grain, livestock, and labor gradually expanded into lists, letters, laws, and chronicles. Suddenly, human memory could escape the limits of flesh and mind. Stories, transactions, and events could survive long after their creators had died. Writing changed everything. For the first time, humanity could record not only what had happened, but why it mattered. Kings commissioned annals to document their reigns and victories. Priests inscribed rituals to preserve divine order, and merchants kept ledgers to track trade and wealth. Civilization itself became legible, a narrative that could be studied, analyzed, and built upon. Whereas oral traditions were bound by the frailty of memory and the distortion of retelling, writing offered a kind of immortality. Mesopotamian scribes recorded myths like the Epic of Gilgamesh, ensuring that the story of a king's quest for immortality would endure for millennia. Laws were codified, most famously in the Code of Hammurabi, which etched into stone the principles of justice and governance. With writing, authority could be communicated across time and space. A decree issued in Ur could be understood in a distant city a century after it was inscribed. Writing extended human power beyond the individual and beyond the lifespan. Simultaneously, in Egypt, hieroglyphs flourished along the Nile. Their elegant symbols, etched in stone or painted on papyrus, recorded pharaonic deeds, religious texts, and funerary instructions. The Book of the Dead, composed over centuries, offered guidance to the deceased navigating the afterlife. Hieroglyphs were more than practical. They were sacred, a means of connecting the earthly and divine. Through symbols, the Egyptians codified their understanding of the cosmos, mortality, and the ruler's role in maintaining balance, or ma'at. In the Indus Valley, the enigmatic script of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro shows us that writing was not confined to Mesopotamia and Egypt. Although undeciphered, these symbols reflect a sophisticated system of communication, likely tied to trade, administration, and perhaps ritual. In China, oracle bones reveal one of the earliest forms of written language, recording divinations, royal decisions, and questions posed to ancestors. Writing, in these civilizations, became the vehicle for governance, commerce, law, and belief, a technology of thought as much as of communication. The implications of writing extended far beyond administration. It enabled history itself. Events could be recorded, celebrated, or mourned with permanence. Battles were chronicled, treaties inscribed, victories glorified, defeats mourned. History could now be transmitted in ways that did not depend solely on memory or myth. Civilization could remember itself. The deeds of kings and gods, once ephemeral in song and legend, could now endure in a medium resistant to time. Writing also transformed human consciousness. With oral traditions, memory is immediate, personal, and performative. With writing, memory becomes externalized, objective, and analyzable. Humans could compare events, detect patterns, and deliberate on cause and consequence. Chronologies emerged. Empires began to understand themselves as sequences of events, not merely as eternal orders. Writing made reflection possible, and reflection gave rise to philosophy, governance, and long-term planning. The social effects of writing were profound. Literacy created hierarchies of knowledge. Scribes, trained in complex systems of symbols, became indispensable. They held the tools of power, serving kings, priests, and merchants. Knowledge, once communal, now carried the weight of specialization. Civilizations learned that the ability to read and write was not just cultural, it was political, strategic, and essential for survival. Yet writing was also a bridge to imagination. Epic poetry, hymns, prayers, and myths could now survive centuries intact. The tales of heroes and gods became records not only of events, but of values, ethics, and human psychology. Through written words, civilizations could encode the wisdom of generations, offering guidance and insight across ages. In this way, writing extended humanity's reach into the future, allowing even the birth of written history also marked a profound psychological shift. Mortality, once the ultimate erasure, was now defied in ink and clay. Kings, heroes, and gods could live forever on tablets and walls. Ordinary people, too, could leave traces, tokens, inscriptions, and graffiti that spoke of daily life. Writing democratized memory in ways that oral tradition could not. It preserved the mundane alongside the monumental, the human alongside the divine. And so, with the dawn of writing, humanity crossed a new frontier. Survival alone was no longer enough. Civilization could now be analyzed, chronicled, and transmitted. Knowledge could accumulate, and progress became conceivable. Human experience was recorded not only in bones and settlements, but in words, symbols, and stories that would echo across millennia. Writing, in essence, made history possible. It allowed humanity to learn systematically from its own journey, to question, to reflect, and to aspire. With writing, the first men and women of civilization achieved a form of immortality, creating a lineage of knowledge that continues to guide us today. The story of humanity, once ephemeral, had found its enduring medium. In the long view, writing is more than technology. It is the vessel of human consciousness, the archive of thought, the scaffold upon which civilization builds its identity. From accounting clay tablets to epic poetry, from royal inscriptions to religious texts, written history transformed humanity from mere survivors into chroniclers, philosophers, and visionaries. The birth of written history was therefore not an endpoint, but a new beginning. It was a portal from prehistory into history, from memory into legacy, from fleeting existence into enduring civilization. The first man, who once wandered in search of food and shelter, had given rise to societies capable of remembering, reflecting, and shaping the future. The written word had become the vessel through which humanity could transcend time itself. Having emerged from survival and settlement, and having chronicled their existence through writing, humanity stood at a crossroads. The first civilizations of Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and early China had established cities, kings, and written histories. Yet civilization was not meant to remain confined to river valleys or desert oases. Its defining features, agriculture, metallurgy, urban planning, social organization, and literacy, were destined to spread, carried not only by conquest but by migration, trade, and the inexorable human impulse to connect, imitate, and innovate. The diffusion of civilization was neither uniform nor instantaneous. It was uneven, patchwork, and often contingent upon geography and necessity. Rivers and seas acted as both conduits and barriers. The Fertile Crescent, cradled between the Tigris and Euphrates, produced the first urban centers. From there, knowledge of agriculture, animal domestication, and irrigation diffused gradually westward to Anatolia and Europe, eastward to Persia and South Asia. Farming techniques, pottery styles, and the concept of urban governance moved with people, slowly transforming the landscapes they touched. As civilizations spread across continents, the first cities, empires, and kingdoms inevitably encountered one another. Wherever human ambition flourished, tension followed. Resources were finite, borders were porous, and the ambitions of kings and chiefs often collided. The story of early humanity is therefore not only one of innovation and cultural diffusion, but also of conflict and alliance, the twin forces that shaped history long before the modern nation-state emerged. The first conflicts were often local and immediate. In Mesopotamia, city-states such as Uruk, Lagash, and Kish vied for control over arable land, water sources, and trade routes. Irrigation systems, so vital to survival, became points of contention. Kings raised armies of conscripted laborers and professional soldiers, erecting walls and fortifications to defend against rivals. Battles were fought not only with weapons, but with strategy, diplomacy, and negotiation. A siege could starve a city into submission, while marriages and treaties might secure alliances as effectively as swords. Yet these conflicts were rarely merely destructive. They stimulated organization, military innovation, and political sophistication. Armies required supply chains, leadership hierarchies, and logistics. Fortifications demanded engineering knowledge. Diplomacy necessitated communication, record-keeping, and negotiation. In short, war often accelerated the very capabilities that allowed civilization to survive and expand. Conflict, paradoxically, was a crucible of progress. In Egypt, the dynamics were different, but no less intense. The Nile Valley, bounded by deserts and cataracts, offered natural protection, yet control over fertile land and trade routes was fiercely contested. Pharaohs launched campaigns into Nubia and the Levant, not merely to conquer, but to secure resources, gold, ivory, timber, and maintain prestige. Military expeditions were tightly integrated with religious authority. Victories were portrayed as divine sanction, reinforcing the pharaoh's legitimacy. The intertwining of religion and warfare became a defining feature of early civilization. Beyond Mesopotamia and Egypt, conflicts shaped the trajectories of other early civilizations. In the Indus Valley, the archaeological record suggests the existence of fortified settlements and strategic city planning, implying concern over potential hostilities. While evidence of large-scale warfare is scarce, regional competition over trade, water, and land undoubtedly occurred. Likewise, in early China, dynastic struggles and clashes along the Yellow River prompted the development of armies, defensive walls, and centralized administration. The seeds of imperial power were born in the pressures of conflict. Yet alongside confrontation, alliances emerged as a crucial tool for survival. Treaties, marriages, and trade agreements created networks of mutual benefit that extended influence without immediate conquest. In Mesopotamia, city-states occasionally formed coalitions to repel invasions or stabilize trade. Kings recognized that collaboration could enhance security, economic prosperity, and political legitimacy. Alliances were fragile, subject to betrayal and shifting loyalties. Yet they became a fundamental mechanism through which civilizations managed the uncertainties of the world. The use of alliances reveals a sophisticated understanding of strategy. Leaders knew that strength alone did not guarantee security. The ability to negotiate, compromise, and coordinate with neighbors often determined survival. Diplomatic gifts, hostages, and ceremonial marriages became instruments of statecraft. Civilization, at this stage, was not merely about cities and armies. It was about networks of relationships, obligations, and mutual dependence. Trade often reinforced alliances. Mesopotamian merchants traveled to Anatolia, Egypt, and the Levant, carrying goods as well as ideas. Economic partnerships created incentives to avoid conflict and maintain stability. A caravan could cement ties between distant polities more effectively than a war, as prosperity encouraged cooperation. Early diplomacy, in this sense, was intertwined with commerce, weaving economic interests into the fabric of political relationships. Conflict and alliance also influenced cultural development. Military campaigns facilitated the exchange of technology, art, and knowledge. Conquered peoples contributed architectural styles, metallurgical techniques, and administrative methods. For example, the Akkadian Empire absorbed Sumerian culture while imposing its own administrative innovations. Egypt incorporated Nubian, Asiatic, and Libyan influences during periods of expansion and occupation. Through conflict and alliance, civilizations evolved, borrowing, adapting, and integrating new practices. Religion frequently intersected with both war and diplomacy. Deities were invoked to justify conquest or to bless alliances. Temples and rituals reinforced political legitimacy. The idea of divine favor became a currency of authority, used both to rally armies and to negotiate peace. In this way, the sacred and the secular were inseparable, illustrating that early civilizations perceived their struggles not merely as political contests, but as moral and cosmic imperatives. The technological dimension of conflict was equal. In China, early dynastic conflicts along the Yellow River laid the foundation for centralized authority and bureaucratic governance. The Shang and Zhou dynasties consolidated power through military campaigns, but also through marriages, treaties, and ritual legitimacy. Leaders understood that enduring control required both force and diplomacy, a lesson that would echo throughout Chinese history. Even in regions often overlooked, such as the Americas, conflict and alliance shaped societies. Mesoamerican city-states engaged in warfare to control trade and tribute, while simultaneously forming alliances that regulated economic and religious interaction. In the Andes, competing chiefdoms negotiated territory, resources, and ceremonial authority, demonstrating that early humans everywhere grappled with the balance of war and cooperation. Conflict and alliance, in sum, were not merely the prelude to empire. They were the crucibles in which civilization itself was forged. They demanded organization, strategy, and foresight. They tested leadership, morality, and resilience. They spurred innovation and adaptation. Without these pressures, cities might have remained static, isolated, and fragile. Through confrontation and collaboration, early societies evolved, spread, and endured. Reflecting on this era, we see the timeless patterns of human society emerge. Leaders must navigate between ambition and diplomacy. Communities must balance competition with cooperation. Warfare and negotiation are intertwined, and the outcomes of these interactions shape not only political boundaries but cultural identity, economic networks, and technological progress. The first men of civilization were architects not only of cities, but of a complex, interdependent world. As we study early conflicts and alliances, a profound truth becomes evident. Civilization is never isolated. It is a web of interactions, a network of influence, and a dynamic system of relationships. Success depends not only on strength or ingenuity, but on the ability to engage with others, sometimes through battle, through negotiation, always through adaptation. The first civilizations understood, perhaps instinctively, that survival demanded both courage and diplomacy. In the end, early conflicts and alliances reveal the dual nature of human ambition. Humans strive for dominance, yet depend on cooperation. They innovate in war and governance alike. They endure losses and leverage victories. Through this dynamic interplay, civilizations did not merely survive. They evolved, expanded, and laid the foundations for the complex world that would follow. The legacy of these early struggles is etched not only in the ruins of cities or the inscriptions of kings, but in the enduring patterns of human society. Alliances, diplomacy, and warfare continue to shape the political, economic, and cultural landscapes of the world. By studying these earliest interactions, we understand that the first men of the world were not only survivors and builders, they were strategists, negotiators, and architects of the social order that defines human history. Trade was one of the earliest vectors of cultural transmission. Caravans traversed deserts, carrying not only grain and livestock, but ideas, symbols, and rituals. The trade of lapis lazuli, copper, and tin connected disparate settlements across Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and the Iranian Plateau. Along these routes, innovations in metallurgy, writing, and religious practice spread. The wheel, initially a practical tool for transportation and pottery, became a symbol of technological ingenuity that appeared in multiple civilizations independently or through cultural transmission. Each exchange of goods carried with it an exchange of knowledge. Empires also facilitated the spread of civilization through conquest and administration. When Sargon of Akkad united Mesopotamian city-states under a single rule, he not only imposed authority, but also integrated economic systems, standard weights and measures, and administrative practices. Later, the Egyptians, Hittites, and Chinese dynasties spread architectural styles, religious rites, and bureaucratic methods far beyond their capitals. Conquest imposed order, but it also spread culture. Roads and fortifications, built to control territories, became channels for ideas as well as armies. Religion played a pivotal role in diffusion. As priests, shamans, and scribes traveled, they carried myths, rituals, and sacred knowledge. The pantheons of Mesopotamia influenced the religions of surrounding regions. Egyptian deities were incorporated into Greek and Roman thought. Vedic rituals from the Indian subcontinent traveled along migration routes into Southeast Asia. Ideas of divine kingship, moral codes, and ritual hierarchy became templates for societies seeking stability. Civilization spread as much through belief as through material means. The migration of peoples accelerated cultural diffusion. Nomadic pastoralists, who once roamed with herds, carried with them innovations from settled communities. Horses, chariots, and new tools enabled faster travel and broader contact. The Indo-European migrations, for instance, transported languages, religious motifs, and social structures across Europe, South Asia, and the Near East. Each migration was a conduit for civilization, blending old traditions with new contexts, producing hybrid cultures. Technological innovations were particularly contagious. The mastery of bronze, for example, transformed warfare, agriculture, and art. Cities that adopted bronze tools gained a strategic advantage, which in turn encouraged neighboring regions to adopt similar technologies. Writing systems, too, inspired adaptations. Cuneiform influenced Elamite, Hittite, and later Akkadian scripts. Hieroglyphs inspired Proto-Sinaitic symbols that ultimately evolved into Phoenician and alphabetic writing. Knowledge traveled faster than armies. Agricultural techniques diffused alongside technology. Irrigation methods perfected in Mesopotamia were adapted in Egypt. Rice cultivation from the Yangtze spread southward into Southeast Asia. Maize farming developed in Mesoamerica, influencing diverse indigenous cultures across the Americas. Each innovation allowed populations to support larger communities, which in turn fostered cities, markets, and complex social hierarchies. Civilization spread because survival was enhanced when communities adopted what worked elsewhere. Cultural diffusion was also social. Music, dance, clothing, and cuisine traveled along the same networks as trade and conquest. Artistic motifs, geometric designs, animal depictions, and stylized human figures appeared across continents, often independently, but sometimes through contact. Storytelling, myths, and oral traditions migrated alongside people, enriching local narratives and integrating foreign heroes and deities into native pantheons. Civilization was as much about imagination as it was about tools. The spread of civilization also brought challenges. Contact between societies could lead to conflict, exploitation, and disease. Yet it also encouraged adaptation. Civilizations observed each other, borrowed strategies, and learned to survive in new contexts. The ability to absorb, modify, and integrate ideas became as important as invention. Culture was not static. It was porous, resilient, and dynamic. Some of the earliest examples of cross-civilizational influence are striking. Mesopotamian religious concepts traveled to Anatolia and the Levant, influencing Hittite and Canaanite traditions. Egyptian architecture inspired Nubian pyramids and Mediterranean temples. The Indus Valley script may have influenced Proto-Dravidian cultures. Trade in precious metals and stones fostered shared technologies, from metallurgy to ceramics. Civilization spread as a living organism, replicating and adapting in multiple environments. Urbanization spread rapidly with it. As ideas of city planning and governance moved, settlements grew more complex. Streets were laid out in grids, drainage systems appeared, and administrative buildings centralized authority. Standardization of weights and measures allowed trade to expand, while writing ensured that contracts and transactions were enforceable over distance. Civilization multiplied not by accident, but by replication and adaptation of proven structures. Moreover, the spread of civilization accelerated the pace of human thought. Writing, mathematics, astronomy, and law traveled between cities, inspiring discoveries. Calendars developed to track agricultural cycles. As we consider the spread of civilization, it becomes clear that humanity's journey is one of interconnection. No city, empire, or culture existed in isolation. Every settlement drew from the experiences, knowledge, and innovations of its neighbors. Civilization multiplied, diversified, and enriched itself through contact and exchange. The first men who planted seeds, raised walls, and inscribed tablets had set in motion a process that would shape the entire globe. The spread of civilization was, in essence, the expansion of human potential. It was the extension of knowledge, governance, and culture beyond the limits of individual communities. It enabled trade, diplomacy, innovation, and cultural dialogue. It allowed humans to confront larger challenges, to envision a world greater than the sum of its parts. In every new city built, every tablet inscribed, and every trade route forged, humanity extended its reach physically, intellectually, and culturally. And so, the story of the first civilizations is also the story of connection. From Mesopotamia to the Nile, the Indus Valley to China, Mesoamerica to the Andes, human ingenuity and adaptation spread, linking communities, ideas, and innovations across time and space. Civilization multiplied because it was contagious, not in disease but in knowledge, culture, and aspiration. The first men, once wanderers of the wilderness, had created networks of permanence, influence, and memory. The legacy of this spread is enduring. Roads, canals, scripts, religious ideas, agricultural methods, and artistic motifs. These early transmissions form the foundation upon which later empires, nations, and modern societies were built. Each innovation, each trade route, each the first men and women of civilization did not merely settle. They connected, taught, and inspired. Their achievements remind us that human progress is a cumulative, shared endeavor. Civilization spreads not merely by birth or conquest, but through communication, cooperation, and adaptation. The spread of civilization, then, is both a story of triumph and fragility. Cities and empires rose and fell, ideas diffused or were lost, yet the cumulative knowledge of humanity endured. Exchange was a thread in a vast tapestry, connecting the first men of the world to every generation that followed. Civilization spread because humans sought permanence, understanding, and legacy, and in doing so, they transformed the entire planet. Civilization, in its earliest forms, was defined as much by what humans created as by where they settled. Beyond the walls of cities and the records of kings, the true marvel of the first civilizations lay in their innovation, the tools, techniques, and ideas that enabled humans to shape their environment, organize society, and envision futures previously unimaginable. Innovation was the engine of survival, expansion, and influence. It was the thread that wove together the disparate stories of Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, China, and beyond, forging a shared trajectory of human ingenuity. One of the most transformative innovations was agriculture itself. Though simple at first, early farming techniques evolved into complex systems of irrigation, crop rotation, and soil management. In Mesopotamia, canals diverted the waters of the Tigris and Euphrates to nourish fields, allowing cities to sustain large populations. The Nile's predictable flooding enabled Egyptian planters to cultivate vast tracts of fertile land with minimal effort, integrating agricultural cycles with religious and administrative calendars. The Indus Valley employed sophisticated drainage and water management systems, demonstrating remarkable foresight in urban planning and resource allocation. Agriculture was more than subsistence. It was the foundation of surplus, trade, and the societal complexity that would follow. Metallurgy transformed human capability and status. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, revolutionized warfare, tools, and artistry. Sword blades became sharper, plows more durable, and ceremonial objects more intricate. The mastery of metalworking allowed civilizations to harness natural resources in unprecedented ways. Cities accumulated wealth in the form of ingots, tools, and ornaments, creating both economic power and social stratification. Iron would later supersede bronze, but the earliest metallurgical innovations established the template for technological progress that reverberates across millennia. Writing, as explored in previous segments, was itself an innovation that reshaped human consciousness. It enabled record-keeping, administration, law, literature, and philosophy. Cuneiform, hieroglyphs, oracle bone scripts, and the still undeciphered Indus symbols were not merely tools of communication. They were instruments of civilization, structuring thought, memory, and social organization. Literacy created hierarchies of knowledge while enabling cultural continuity, transforming ephemeral human experience into lasting history. Urban planning represented another critical innovation. Cities were no longer spontaneous agglomerations, but deliberately organized spaces. Streets, residential zones, marketplaces, and temples were carefully laid out. Drainage systems, granaries, and fortifications demonstrated an understanding of public health, economy, and security. The Indus Valley exemplified this sophistication with grid patterns, standardized brick sizes, and advanced sanitation systems that rival modern urban planning. Innovation in city design was both practical and symbolic. It expressed human control over space, resources, and collective life. Mathematics and astronomy emerged as indispensable innovations, intricately linked to both practical needs and spiritual aspirations. Mesopotamian mathematicians developed arithmetic, geometry, and early algebra to survey land, construct buildings, and record trade. Astronomical observations enabled the creation of calendars, guiding planting, harvests, and religious festivals. Egyptian priests and architects used geometric principles to align pyramids with celestial phenomena, reflecting an intersection of science, art, and ritual. These intellectual innovations enabled civilizations to predict, measure, and organize their world with increasing precision. Trade innovations multiplied cultural influence. Early civilizations created standardized weights and measures, ensuring fairness and facilitating commerce over long distances. Maritime navigation and overland caravan systems enabled the exchange of luxury goods, raw materials, and ideas. Through trade, distant societies shared agricultural practices, metallurgy techniques, religious motifs, and writing systems. The diffusion of innovation across civilizations demonstrates that creativity is rarely confined to one location. It thrives through interaction, observation, and adaptation. Religious and philosophical innovations shaped social cohesion and moral frameworks. Temples, rituals, and priesthoods provided structure, hierarchy, and shared belief systems. Ziggurats in Mesopotamia, pyramids in Egypt, and ceremonial complexes in Mesoamerica were architectural expressions of cosmology and divine order. Philosophical concepts of justice in Mesopotamia, Ma'at in Egypt, and ancestral reverence in China offered ethical frameworks that regulated society. These innovations ensured that humans could cooperate, organize labor, and maintain continuity across generations. Military innovations were crucial for the survival and expansion of early civilizations. The development of bronze weaponry, chariots, fortified walls, and strategic logistics allowed empires to defend, expand, and project power. Armies became organized hierarchies capable of sustaining prolonged campaigns. The integration of military strategy with political authority and religious legitimacy exemplifies how innovation was holistic, technological, administrative, and cultural simultaneously. Without these innovations, cities could not defend themselves nor enforce the laws and agreements that underpinned civilization. Relief, sculpture, and art were also innovations with far-reaching cultural impact. Mesopotamian steles, Egyptian hieroglyphic murals, and Indus seals conveyed narratives, recorded laws, and communicated authority. Art became a medium for memory, ideology, and identity. Beyond mere aesthetics, visual innovation reinforced social hierarchy, religious beliefs, and political legitimacy. Artistic creativity was intertwined with communication and governance, making it a function. The cumulative effect of these innovations, technological, social, intellectual, and cultural, was transformative. They allowed cities to flourish, populations to grow, and civilizations to endure. But perhaps more importantly, they fostered a mindset that humans could shape their environment, organize complex societies, record and reflect upon experience, and transmit knowledge across generations. Innovation became both a practical necessity and a defining feature of humanity itself. Yet innovation was not uniform. It was uneven, contingent upon geography, resources, culture, and necessity. Mesopotamia's arid plains encouraged irrigation. Egypt's predictable floods enabled monumental construction. China's fertile valleys fostered early agriculture and metallurgy. The Indus Valley's urban density necessitated sanitation systems. Civilization evolved differently in each region, yet shared certain universal innovations that allowed societies to scale, adapt, and connect. The spread of these innovations amplified their impact. Trade, conquest, diplomacy, and migration ensured that technological, social, and cultural ideas crossed regions and continents. Writing traveled with trade, metallurgy diffused with migration, religious and philosophical concepts moved with alliances. Early innovations were not isolated achievements. They were seeds planted across the world, shaping the trajectory of global civilization. Reflecting on the innovations of the ancient world, we see that they were not merely practical. They were deeply human. They expressed ambition, creativity, foresight, and imagination. They encoded collective experience and shaped collective identity. Each tool, city, law, or story was a manifestation of the first human's desire to transcend the limits of survival, to impose order on chaos, and to ensure continuity across time. Innovation, in this sense, was the lifeblood of civilization. It allowed humanity to endure floods, droughts, invasions, and social upheaval. It created surplus, wealth, and leisure. It enabled learning, reflection, and culture. It fostered networks of exchange, alliances, and understanding. Civilization, at its core, was a web of innovation, each strand reinforcing the others, each advancing on the previous, creating a complex, adaptive, and enduring human ecosystem. Ultimately, the innovations of the ancient world remind us that humanity's earliest achievements were not merely accidental. They were deliberate responses to the challenges of environment, society, and survival. They were experiments in organization, creativity, and foresight, and they left a legacy that echoes to this day. Cities, writing, law, technology, art, and knowledge, all foundations upon which subsequent generations would build, innovate, and thrive. The story of early innovations is, therefore, inseparable from the story of civilization itself. Each advancement, whether monumental or subtle, represents the first humans' attempt to assert mastery over their world while remaining ever aware of their fragility. Through innovation, they shaped their environment, organized society, chronicled their existence, and passed a cumulative heritage to the future. In this light, civilization is as much a testament to human creativity and resilience as it is to survival. The innovations of the ancient world laid the groundwork for every subsequent epoch, from the classical civilizations of Greece, Rome, and China to the modern globalized societies of today. They demonstrate that human progress is cumulative, interconnected, and dependent on the capacity to learn, adapt, and create. The first men of the world, in their brilliance and determination, were architects of a legacy that would transcend geography, culture, and time itself. The rise of civilization is a story of ingenuity, ambition, and resilience, but it is equally a story of fragility. Even the greatest cities, empires, and cultures faced forces beyond their control: environmental shifts, internal instability, resource depletion, disease, and invasion. Civilizations, like living organisms, flourished and eventually transformed, leaving behind ruins, stories, and innovations that continued to influence subsequent generations. The collapse of early civilizations was trade networks, which had previously transmitted ideas and goods, also adapted to the collapse of major centers. When urban hubs fell, trade routes shifted, creating new centers of economic and cultural exchange. The collapse of one city could catalyze growth elsewhere. In this way, human ingenuity and connectivity ensured continuity, demonstrating that civilization is a resilient network rather than a fragile edifice. The collapse of early civilizations also reshaped political authority. Fragmented polities often gave rise to smaller kingdoms, chiefdoms, or confederations. In some cases, regional powers reconstituted themselves into larger empires, as in Mesopotamia with Babylonian consolidation or in Egypt with the Middle and New Kingdoms. Collapse was thus both a destructive and generative force, dismantling rigid structures while permitting new forms of governance and social organization. Environmental awareness and adaptation became central lessons. Societies that survived collapse demonstrated the importance of sustainable practices, flexible governance, and responsive social structures. Irrigation systems were improved, flood management refined, and urban planning adapted to changing conditions. The collapse of one civilization informed the strategies of the next, embedding resilience into the cultural DNA of human societies. Culturally, collapse stimulated creativity and reinterpretation. Myths, literature, and religious practices were reshaped to explain catastrophe, human fragility, and divine will. The Epic of Gilgamesh, for instance, reflects themes of mortality, destruction, and human striving, ideas likely shaped by periods of social and environmental upheaval. Collapse was not merely a historical event. It became a lens through which humans understood themselves, their societies, and their place in the cosmos. In sum, the collapse of early civilizations was a multidimensional process: environmental, social, economic, and political, yet it was rarely absolute. Transformation, adaptation, and resilience ensured that human knowledge, culture, and innovation persisted. Successive generations learned from the failures of their predecessors, integrating lessons into new forms of social organization, governance, and technology. Civilization, even in decline, left a cumulative legacy that informed the next wave of human achievement. The transformation of early civilizations illustrates a profound historical principle: survival depends on adaptability. Cities, empires, and cultures are vulnerable to both internal and external pressures. Yet humanity's capacity to learn, reorganize, and innovate ensures continuity even in the face of apparent destruction. Collapse is not merely an end. It is an opportunity for reinvention, reflection, and evolution. Archaeology bears witness to this cycle. Ruins, inscriptions, and artifacts reveal the grandeur and fragility of early urban centers. They show us not only what was lost, but what was preserved, adapted, and transmitted. Every brick, tablet, and relic tells a story of ambition, ingenuity, vulnerability, and resilience. The collapse of early civilizations is thus inseparable from the story of human survival and innovation. Ultimately, the lessons of early collapse remain relevant today. Human societies continue to face environmental stress, political fragmentation, and technological disruption. The histories of Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and early China remind us that achievement is fragile, yet knowledge and culture can endure. Civilizations may fall, but the human capacity for adaptation, creativity, and legacy persists. The first men of the world, through both triumph and collapse, bequeath to us a history that is not static but evolving, a continuum of resilience, learning, and transformation. The collapse of early civilizations, therefore, was not a conclusion, but a transformation. It redistributed power, preserved innovation, reshaped social structures, and ensured the continuity of human knowledge. By studying these ancient declines, we understand the fragility and resilience of civilization, the interdependence of environment, society, and governance, and the enduring capacity of humanity to rebuild, innovate, and endure. Through collapse, transformation, and continuity, the first civilizations left a template for all societies to follow, a testament to human ingenuity, adaptability, and the relentless pursuit of permanence in an impermanent world. The ruins of Ur, the abandoned streets of Mohenjo-daro, the crumbling pyramids of the Old Kingdom, and the remnants of Shang cities are more than relics. They are mirrors reflecting the enduring cycle of human aspiration, fragility, and renewal. As we reflect on the millennia of human endeavor, it becomes clear that the story of the first man in the world is not confined to the distant past. The legacy of those early humans, their innovations, struggles, and triumphs, persists in every corner of our modern existence. Civilization, as we know it today, is the cumulative result of countless generations who cultivated knowledge, built societies, and sought meaning in a complex and often unforgiving world. The first men and women, in their survival, exploration, and ingenuity, set humanity on a path that continues to define us. The earliest humans left their mark not only through physical traces, but through the very structures of human thought. Tools, art, and rudimentary communication were more than practical solutions. They were the beginnings of abstract thinking, problem-solving, and symbolic understanding. The first man who carved a stone tool or painted a hand on a cave wall was experimenting with the principles of design, cause and effect, and permanence. These experiments would evolve over thousands of years into the writing systems, laws, and artistic conventions that structured civilizations. The cognitive leap from survival to creation established the foundation of human culture. From the cradle of Mesopotamia to the banks of the Nile, the first humans experimented with governance, social organization, and collective labor. They discovered that cooperation, hierarchy, and shared purpose allowed communities to thrive beyond the capabilities of isolated individuals. Early kings and councils, scribes and priests, engineers and farmers all contributed to a growing network of human coordination that would inform every subsequent society. Concepts of law, justice, and administrative oversight originated in these earliest experiments in governance, influencing empires and nations across millennia. Technological legacy is among the most tangible gifts of the first man. Stone tools became bronze implements, later iron, and eventually powered industrialization. Agriculture, first a precarious survival strategy, evolved into complex systems capable of sustaining millions. Irrigation networks, canals, and terraces demonstrate a legacy of environmental manipulation that continues to inspire engineering and urban planning today. The first humans' capacity to innovate, to manipulate their surroundings to meet their needs, is a thread running from the Neolithic to the present. Cultural and religious legacies endure as well. Mythologies, rituals, and beliefs codified in the earliest civilizations persist in subtle forms, adapted and transformed over time. The moral and cosmological frameworks developed by early humans provided a foundation for subsequent philosophies, religions, and social norms. Ideas about divine order, the cyclical nature of life, the relationship between humans and nature, and the ethical treatment of one another all trace their ancestry to the earliest attempts at explanation, ritual, and governance. These frameworks helped societies navigate the uncertainties of existence and endure through crises. Art and storytelling are central to this legacy. From cave paintings to monumental sculptures, from oral traditions to the earliest written narratives, the first humans sought to interpret their experiences and transmit knowledge. Stories encoded cultural norms, historical memory, and ethical lessons, ensuring continuity even amidst collapse or migration. Epic tales like Gilgamesh, inscriptions on stelae, and funerary art in Egypt reflect attempts to preserve both human experience and aspiration. Modern literature, theater, and visual arts all draw upon this inheritance of narrative and symbolic expression. Language, arguably the most profound innovation of the first humans, created the conditions for civilization itself. Spoken language enabled cooperation, planning, and social cohesion. Written language extended memory, formalized law, and enabled communication across space and time. Alphabetic systems, descended from ancient scripts, are the backbone of modern literacy. The ability to transmit knowledge cumulatively from generation to generation, civilization to civilization, is the single most enduring legacy of early humanity. Without language, the monumental achievements of agriculture, architecture, governance, and art would remain fragmented and ephemeral. Urban and social structures, first tested in cities like Mohenjo-daro, and Thebes, inform modern urbanism. Streets, drainage systems, marketplaces, and administrative centers were early laboratories in social organization. These principles underpin contemporary urban planning, logistics, and public policy. The first humans' attempts to balance population, resources, and governance reveal the origins of systems that allow modern societies to manage complexity at scale. Civilization, in this sense, is both a physical and intellectual inheritance. Conflict and cooperation, two sides of the human experience, also form a central component of this legacy. Early wars and alliances shaped political, social, and technological trajectories. They fostered innovation in governance, military strategy, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. Modern states, treaties, and international relations are descendants of these early experiments in negotiation and confrontation. By studying early conflicts and alliances, we observe patterns that resonate in contemporary geopolitics, revealing timeless principles of power, negotiation, and resilience. Religious and philosophical ideas, crystallized in early civilizations, continue to influence human thought. Concepts of morality, leadership, fate, and the divine embodied in Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Chinese, and Mesoamerican traditions persist in adapted forms in modern religions, philosophies, and legal systems. The first humans grappled with existential questions, using ritual, myth, and governance to structure society. Their answers, transformed and reinterpreted over millennia, remain embedded in the ethical and spiritual frameworks that guide humanity today. Trade, technology, and cultural exchange among early civilizations established patterns of globalization long before the term existed. Networks connecting Mesopotamia to Egypt, the Indus Valley, and China facilitated not only goods but also ideas, innovations, and cultural practices. These exchanges laid the groundwork for interconnectivity, demonstrating that human progress thrives on collaboration, adaptation, and mutual influence. Today's globalized economy and transnational communication are a continuation of these ancient networks of exchange. Collapse, transformation, and resilience are also central to the legacy of early humans. The rise and fall of empires, the abandonment and reinvention of cities, and the persistence of knowledge through catastrophe illustrate human adaptability. Lessons from environmental stress, political fragmentation, and social upheaval informed subsequent civilizations, embedding resilience into the human experience. Modern societies, too, face challenges of sustainability, governance, and continuity. The first humans' experiences provide both cautionary tales and sources of inspiration. Perhaps the most profound legacy is intellectual curiosity itself. The first humans sought to understand the world, to predict natural cycles, and to impose order upon chaos. Astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and philosophy all have roots in these early efforts. The desire to know, to explain, and to improve the human condition is the enduring inheritance of the first man. Each subsequent innovation from classical science to modern technology stands upon the foundations they established. The legacy is also ethical and social. Early humans experimented with laws, social hierarchies, and communal responsibilities, creating templates for justice, governance, and social cohesion. Hammurabi's code, Egyptian legal traditions, and Chinese dynastic principles informed subsequent legal systems. The capacity for structured social organization, codified norms, and moral reasoning enabled humans to coordinate at scale, ensuring survival and prosperity. These lessons remain embedded in law, education, and civil society today. The arts, too, reflect enduring continuity. Sculpture, painting, architecture, music, and ritual performance all originated in the earliest human societies. Techniques, motifs, and symbolic languages evolved but never disappeared. Modern art, music, and design are connected to these foundational experiments in expression, demonstrating the power of creativity to transcend time. The first human's pursuit of beauty and meaning resonates across millennia, shaping identity and culture. Legacy extends to the natural environment as well. Early humans manipulated landscapes, domesticated plants and animals, and developed sustainable practices, sometimes succeeding, failing. These interactions shaped ecosystems, agricultural practices, and human understanding of ecology. Lessons from early environmental management, irrigation, crop rotation, land use, and animal husbandry continue to inform modern agriculture, conservation, and urban planning. The first humans' intimate engagement with their environment created a blueprint for coexistence and stewardship. Finally, the legacy of the first man is philosophical. It is a legacy of reflection, adaptation, and moral consideration. They asked, implicitly and explicitly, how should we live? How can we endure? How do we balance survival with aspiration? These questions remain central to human existence. Civilization itself is their answer, a network of tools, laws, ideas, and relationships designed to preserve life, enhance cooperation, and create meaning in a vast and often unpredictable world. In sum, the first man in the world left an inheritance that is at once practical, intellectual, cultural, and ethical. Civilization is not a static monument, but a dynamic continuum, evolving across millennia while retaining the imprint of those earliest experiments in survival, innovation, and social organization. Every city, law, artwork, and scientific discovery traces its ancestry to the first humans who sought to understand and shape their world. As we consider our modern lives, our cities, technologies, legal systems, and cultures, we are participants in a continuum that stretches back tens of thousands of years. The first man planted seeds, literal, technological, and intellectual, that have grown into the complex forests of human achievement. Our knowledge, our societies, our creativity, and even our dilemmas are legacies of these pioneering ancestors. They remind us that humanity's potential is cumulative, built upon the ingenuity, resilience, and aspiration of those who came before. The first man in the world was not merely a historical figure. He was a symbol of human possibility. Every innovation, every risk, every adaptation, every story he created resonates across time, shaping our present and guiding our future. Civilization is his inheritance and ours to carry forward. The legacy of the first humans is the story of human perseverance, creativity, and the enduring quest for meaning.